Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. My name is Chuck Lennox with the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation, and I want to welcome you to our sixth in our webinar series, Global Excellence in Heritage Interpretation, today hosted by Interpretation Australia. I'd like to thank Time Looper and Agents of Discovery for their support of our translation service. The taped version of this webinar will provide a voiceover in Spanish for our members in Spanish-speaking parts of the world. Today's webinar, Unpacking Intangibility, Ways of Seeing, Feeling, and Understanding Culture and Australian Experience. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to put them in the question box and we'll answer those at the end of the talk. And now I'd like to pass the screen over to Kylie Christian, representing Interpretation Australia, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chuck. Let me just share my screen. Let me know when that's come up.
Looks good.
No worries. Well, thank you very much and welcome to the webinar. Before we get started today, I would like to I'd like to first do an acknowledgement to country, which is a practice we do here in Australia, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which our members work, create and interact across modern day Australia. We celebrate all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continued deep connection to the lands and waterways and their cultural heritage and country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to elders past and present, and we are committed to the journey of reconciliation and truth-telling and to supporting the protection of all cultural knowledge and heritage. We also extend a welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and any First Nations peoples joining us today. So before we get started, I'd like to do a quick introduction to today's speakers. Erin Wilkins is a strong and proud Darug woman from the Hawkesbury River area. She is an Aboriginal educator, facilitator and consultant working across all sectors. Erin has been sharing her knowledge for more than 15 years. She was born and raised in Western Sydney and enjoys being on country, protecting and connecting with culture, participating in revitalised traditional practices and encouraging others to share the old ways. Erin develops and delivers Aboriginal cultural workshops, in addition to providing interpretation support, cultural awareness activities, and consultation facilitation. As a member of the collaboration team that brought together the current State Library of New South Wales exhibition, The Real Secret River, Darubbin, Erin has helped to bring awareness of the local Aboriginal culture to a wider audience and help uncover some of the stories and language that were believed to be lost, with a passion for celebrating diversity and the advantages to the community that come from bringing people of varied backgrounds together in a supportive environment, promoting awareness and strengthening connection to culture and country. Erin is a definite champion for community cohesiveness through respect and understanding of alternative perspectives through her culture. She'll be speaking a little bit later tonight, and our other speaker this evening is Alice Steedman, who graduated as an architect in 1984 with a thesis based on the application of participatory design processes within a suburban Aboriginal community-controlled health service. The thesis was the start of a long journey of learning and cultural understanding that continues today. The concept of participatory design developed in Scandinavia in the 1960s as a means of democratizing the design process to enhance her empowerment and improve, to enhance user empowerment and improve design outcomes. Alice overlaid the theoretical understanding of cross-cultural research methodologies and ethics of the social sciences in a practical application of involving the staff, clients and executive of the Perth Aboriginal Medical Service in the development of a functional brief for a new building. Sounds fascinating, doesn't it? Whilst the thesis was seen as a work in progress, the outcome resulted in a number of projects in metropolitan Perth in Western Australia over the following 25 years. Alice has predominantly practiced as a heritage architect, built heritage being the silent partner in a participatory design process, as the means of empowering its lessons are hidden in the fabric and archival record. And she'll undoubtedly explain all of that to us a little bit later. Lastly, I'm Kylie Christian, President of Interpretation Australia, and I welcome you along. I'm also a Heritage and Interpretation Specialist. I'm a qualified historian, professional photographer, digital artist, public art designer and curator, and a certified project manager. I am also certified through the National Association for Interpretation in America and am completing postgraduate research in heritage and interpretation through the University of Leicester in the UK. Obviously, I like to get the world view on things. I also have over 25 years of experience in heritage and interpretation assessment and documentation across sites of local significance to those of World Heritage listings here in Australia. I'm also an executive committee member along with Chuck and others with the Global Alliance of Heritage Interpretation. I'm on the board of Australia ICOMOS and also the Australian Institute of Project Managers. That's enough about us. What are we here to talk about tonight? So tonight, and let me find my mouse, I have too many computers. Let me get this going. Modern Australia is primarily a Western culture. It derived from the British model and was influenced by the colonisation practices of the 18th and 19th centuries during the Great Expansion of the British Empire. The practices following a long and a very established English foundation, and they have excluded many aspects of Australian history. They neglected the existence of Indigenous Australians who were already here and have been for more than 60,000 years. It overlooked the contribution of women in the stories of great men and in the creation of nations, and it tried very hard to minimise the roles of minority groups such as skilled migrants in the economic growth and cultural history of what was sometimes to be labelled the luckiest country in the world. I really guess that that's always depends on the perspective that you're coming from. Don't get me wrong, Australia is a great place. It's a wonderful place. We have a great multicultural approach to nation building today. We are protected from many things like war and famine. But like much of the world, and this is something most of you will recognise, the official heritage dialogue or our history is one written by the so-called victors, focused on the physicality of the world and one that misses the nuanced intangibility of culture that is so important in creating a community. And there's some pictures of different parts of our wonderful country there for you to feast your eyes on. The narrative taught in Australian schools and written in our textbooks, in our journals and in newspapers has skewed the cultural relevance of many groups, and in some cases the facts are almost non-existent. Because as Mark Twain once said, you know, never let the facts get in the way of a good story, right? Let's have a look at some of the other world civilizations in comparison to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. It's not an exhaustive list at all, but rather just a representative example. And as you can see, nothing quite compares to the true history of Australia. As you can see, we've got, you know, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, ancient China, the Roman Republic, all these things that are so wonderful, and they are wonderful cultures. But in comparison to the length of time that Australian Aboriginal people have been in this country and living on this land, it just doesn't compare. Just a couple of things that's for those around the world who might not know. There's a few myths that have been written into our accepted sort of dialogue and have been for many, many years. One, that Captain Cook discovered Australia. Captain James Cook is often credited with discovering Australia in 1770. However, the continent was already inhabited by Aboriginal people, as I've already said, who have lived here for tens of thousands of years. Also, the Chinese had already visited in the 15th century, followed by the Dutch in the 1600s. Then there was an even earlier Britain in 1688. Finally, Cook wasn't even a captain at the time. He held the rank of lieutenant when he came across Australia. The second myth is that all non-Indigenous Australians are descended from convicts. This is one that has been said to me by many people visiting, and it's true that Britain did transport more than 160,000 convicts to Australia between 1788 and 1868, but not every non-Indigenous Australian has criminal blood coursing through their veins, as nice as that may sound for great storytelling. In fact, it's only about a quarter of us were born overseas, so 26% in fact, which is one of the highest populations in the world for people not born. in the country. And the third one is that Aboriginal people were classified under a Flora and Fauna Act until the 1967 referendum. In fact, Aboriginal people in Australia have never been covered by the Flora and Fauna Act, and either at a state level or at a federal level. Historical reports use the words flora, fauna, and Aboriginal together, which potentially cause a lot of the confusion, and it's just been continued on to this day. In the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Act of 1974, it gave the control of government control over places of social value, places of historic, architectural, or scientific significance, but also places, objects, and features of significance to Aboriginal people. So that kind of caused a melding of facts into some of the myths that we have come across these days. So what's changed since then? Fast forward to 2022, and some things have changed greatly. Some things are in the process of changing, and some we still need to tackle. Australia's story is nothing short of epic, and I say that with true passion, because Aboriginal Australians constitute the world's oldest continuing living culture, and that's a scientific fact. So that one can't be changed, and as much as people like to try and argue these things, that one we know 100%. When the Europeans arrived in Australia in 1788, they already existed hundreds of culturally distinct nations, clans, and language groups. This is recognised and accepted to be true, even if though we're not really sure of the exact numbers and what the breakup was. We're getting closer, and we're always learning. More than 2 centuries later, First Nations people retain an unbroken connection to country, and we recognise and accept this to be true, even if not everybody understands that, but we're working on that as well. It should be noted that in today's modern Australia, Aboriginal people make up 3% of the population. So you consider that 200 years ago, they were 100% of the population, down to 3% in a very short time. This year, the Australian government announced a plan to hold a referendum that would see the Indigenous people permanently represented in government. So steps forward, definitely. It's termed a voice to Parliament. A yes vote in the referendum would constitutionally enshrine an advisory group to government made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders. It's important to recognise that unlike other countries, however, such as New Zealand or Canada, Australia has never completed a successful treaty process with First Nations people. Again, something that we are definitely working on and still fighting the good fight for. We have made progress in our truth-telling. As a nation, we've only recently prioritised this, and we now are seeing the ideas of unveiling, uncovering and rediscovering our real histories, empowering people across Australia. Now more than ever, we see cultural conversations being encouraged and supported by government and corporate players, which is a new aspect that's come into play. In New South Wales, which is the state in which I work, we have new guidelines and standards being introduced that speak of connecting with or designing with country being a significant aspect of our reconciliation journey. They provide very high level ideas around how to integrate a new approach to design and the process as a whole on projects. However, this is a very Western approach to a cultural problem. It is a great start, but should only be viewed as the first steps in an iterative process to fundamentally change how Australians think and approach our history and how we want to tell the story to the world, which is where interpreters come into play. We also see more cultural events occurring, which is fantastic, and not just talking Aboriginal. Obviously, we have a multicultural society, and they're including these into our major tourism programs, recognition of cultural days, and they've begun to see the importance of traditional Indigenous practices like cultural burning in enhancing the health of the land and its people. So these are some of the ones. We have a great Chinese New Year, and we have the Colour Festival and all sorts of things now popping up onto our tourism calendars, which is fantastic for the country to, grow as a whole. But at the same time, we as a nation also have to own up to our failures, both past and present, in the cultural stakes. And our latest one, which probably most of the world heard about, was the destruction of the Yukon Gorge Cave in the Pilbara region in Western Australia in 2020. It was the oldest site of human occupation in Australia that's been identified. It was known primarily as the only inland site in Australia with evidence of continuous human occupation for over 46,000 years, which included through the last ice age. So it's unbelievable to think that it happened. It was a tragedy. It was totally avoidable, and it was a loss of both tangible and intangible values that can't be undone. But we can learn from these mistakes, and we, hopefully will do that. So how does Australia really integrate the intangible qualities of storytelling with the development and reconciliation of modern Australia? This is the question. One of the ways that we have been doing it and really have excelled at recently is to consider the impact of digital technology. And it's something that I'm becoming quite passionate about and getting involved in. Storytelling as an interpreter has been valued in a traditional method of passing on knowledge for over a millennia. Within First Nations cultures, it's a standard. It provides a sense of identity, informs relationships to land and people, and teaches the ancient ways and an understanding of how to live in harmony with country. These are the things I've learned as a non-Indigenous person. But in a world of digital resilience and even addiction, and I have a 17-year-old son, so I do know the word is true, smartphones kind of provide a constant connection between people, and storytelling via screens is the new normal. So a way to both preserve tradition and to reach out to people is one way that we're sort of tackling the problem. There's some great examples. If people want to look up, Melbourne Dreaming is a really great little self-guided tour for historical and contemporary places. Sharing the Dreaming shares the dreaming in a window into, shows a window into Aboriginal culture in different parts of Australia. There's the southeast, there's storybooks, and there's language apps as well. So there's lots of things that can be found online if you want to go looking. Secondly, ensuring that cultural knowledge is passed through traditional custodians. While it's true you don't have to be from within any culture to be able to tell, discuss, or disseminate the historical narrative of events, the connection of people from various cultures provides a greater understanding, a more authentic experience, and ensures accuracy of representation. It's become a really big part of all the work that I do in interpretation, and I see it popping up more and more across larger projects, and even going more wider than states, because New South Wales is potentially one of the most proactive in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural inclusivity into projects, but it gives everybody a voice at the table having this done. And whilst it doesn't rewrite history, and we don't want it to rewrite history because we want to tell all the stories, the good, the bad and the ugly, to quote a movie title, history can be written from multiple perspectives by doing this. It makes history fuller, it makes it realer, and hopefully a more correct representation of the facts is what we strive for. We can all be part of the story, I guess, is what I'm saying. Some Australians are only just realising that this is the case, and they're only just realising that Australia has a really great story to tell. Others, like our next speaker, Erin, come from a culture where it's no surprise that we have one of the greatest of all time stories to tell, one that we are now creating together as we journey into the next stage of Australia's shared future. So on that note, I would like to pass it over to Erin and welcome Erin to tell you about her experiences.
Thanks,
Do you
Kylie.
want to share your screen, or would you like me to do that, Erin?
I probably will get you to share it,
Okay.
if you can,
Yep.
considering all the difficulties I've had in the last hour.
That's all right. I shall do so right now. Tell me when that pops up.
Yeah. So I work a lot with many different industries. And at the moment, what we see a big influx in is about how to engage, and what engagement and respectful and meaningful engagement more so is about in telling our stories. So yes, we do have a large and very rich history, but unfortunately, unlike other countries, when you enter Australia, we don't seem to have our cultural heritage and our cultural history in the forefront. And a lot of people that we're talking to at the moment that are international visitors or international visas are coming through and actually questioning why we don't have our cultural heritage in the forefront. So what we're going to do is we're going to just talk a little bit about how we're engaging, who to engage, who and how and when to engage, basically. So when we're talking about Aboriginal people and our culture and specifically our cultural values, thank you. We have so many different ways of understanding our own histories and our own cultures. Unfortunately, I'm a Durry woman, so I'm from the Sydney Basin, and our people were the first hit, most severely impacted by colonisation. And as an impact of that colonisation, we didn't lose. We don't like the word to say lose. We didn't. Our culture wasn't able to be passed down through our generations because of history of government policies and the fear of what would happen to our people, our families and our children, most importantly. So come my age and my generation, we are struggling to know or to actually put together a complete story of our cultural values and our landscapes. But without understanding all levels of our knowing, we will never be able to do that. And so being able to do that is by actually being able to walk country, to look at country, to feel her vibrations. And feeling her vibrations is extremely, extremely important through the stories, whether they are oral or whether they come through art, whether it be art on rock caves, engravings, through teaching sites, through our kinships and our relationships and our social structures with each other and our environment, and through our ceremonies through song and dance. So being able to link all of those together, and obviously with the help of historical notebooks of the first settlers that come through our country, we're able to finally put a lot more stories back into place. But to hold those stories and to hold those knowledge is not only important for us and for our future generations, but it's also important as an educational tool for many people, no matter where we come from. Okay, the next one. So when we're talking about starting to engage, so start engagement with Aboriginal people right at the beginning of the conception of an idea. Not after the acquisition of land, not after the development application has been approved, not after the infrastructure has been built, but right at the beginning, and get them involved in, start creating those relationships, start knowing who's around. And that's where we kind of come into, how do we know we're talking to the right people? Unfortunately, yes, there are many, many people that have stories and connections of some sort to our country, but a lot of people seem to be going in and finding people that know stuff of country, but not of who are there. So it's really, really important that we find those traditional custodians, the ones that can actually talk for and on country. So as history kind of redirects itself back in time again, our voices on our own countries are quietened, and those voices that come from government agencies or come from those that are louder seem to be taken and heard when they don't actually understand the cultural value and the cultural landscape of the countries that they're talking about. And that's really, really important when we're talking about interpretation. But building those relationships, and those relationships aren't easy to build. We, as a people, we have been, there has been so much exploitation, so much abuse, abusive relationship. But it's about building those relationships on long-lasting trust, and and continuing them to have sustainable and long-term relationships. So we're building our relationships on respect, and respect, love and humility is the basis of our foundations of culture. So being able to earn that respect is really important. And it's not about coming in with a suit, and it's not about coming in with whatever, it's about sitting. So our people sit around the fires. We talk about the fire because the fire holds our knowledge. The fire shares our knowledge, and anything that's negative that's said at that fire is then burnt. So it's never to be repeated, it's moved on. So take that time to build those relationships. It doesn't happen overnight. And it's just really, really important that we continue that. But once we've got our applications and once we got through, being able to walk on country and understand country from their point of view, from our point of view as custodial people of that land, is really, really important. Because we can do a lot of interpretation for site-specific locations, like a moment in land, but our sites aren't isolated. Our sites sit inside an entire landscape of story and passage. And being able to understand that story and that entire landscape is going to be helping us to do that interpretation, to do it respectfully, meaningfully, and in the proper ways. So recently, there's been more and more organisations and companies that are recognising the benefits of actually developing these partnerships with our people, and are working really hard to create and implement effective Indigenous engagement strategies. So one thing that I do when people are coming to us and looking for ideas or looking for guidance or looking for consultation about interps or about design or about location, I won't stop and give them a lot of information straight off. In this picture, this is a group of different developers, planners, landscapers that I brought into a space that they had acquired. And before they're breaking ground on that particular plot of land, I'm gathering them all to talk about what culture is, to talk about our country is. And I'm actually walking them through a block of land and explaining what is significant about this plant, why is it important to the relationship of the other plants, to the animals, to our people. And I think getting an understanding and appreciation of where our culture sits in that landscape is able to then pass on the knowledge of our stories. So while we're working with country, it's about recognising, connecting and designing with country. Like Kylie have just said, the Working with Country draft framework was a 12-month pilot, which then imploded on the built environment industry. It had intentions of creating meaningful relationship and better processes, and it encouraged a lot more collaborative and collective work alongside all people. From that became the Designing with Country. It's a discussion paper originally that encouraged stakeholders to respond to Aboriginal cultural connections to country when they were designing and phasing in new projects. From that, there is also a recognising or part of the Designing with Country framework. Specifically, I've worked in one of the big new growth precincts, and to be able to put a development or an interp or anything like that onto that piece of land, we have designed a framework where people actually have to do their own research before contacting us. They then have to walk country with us, they have to sit with us, they have to learn certain knowledge before they can take that on and even put in a tender or an application for it to be moving forward. So we've done that in consultation with government architects, and we've also done that with DPI, which is the Department of Planning, Industry and Environments. So there's new forging ahead, which looks promising, but I think it's understanding the respect and the appropriation and the appreciation of our culture and the way it's then delivered on a public platform. That's important. And when we're coming through that, it's about keeping our protocols in place. For Aboriginal people, yes, we're working in two worlds. So we have our own custodial protocols and obligations that we need to keep to our culture and to our country. But we also have, we're living in a place where We need to be sharing our knowledge, but sharing it in a safe space. And being able to sit in a safe space isn't really easy. For me, I was just recently in a space where the duty of care was breached. I was put in an extremely culturally unsafe environment. And that's not right. So it's about trying to make sure that the people that you're engaging in, no matter where they're from, but the people that you're engaging are the right people, and that the respect is kind of being in a two-way relationship. We do have a lot of cultural sensitive knowledge, and sometimes people will want to share knowledge and we can't share that with you because it is either culturally sensitive for a gender role or for a sacredness or a story. And the respect of knowing when we don't want to share for a reason. It's not about probing. And with that comes cultural intellectual property. So our stories, our language, our knowledge, it's still ours. We might share it with you, but it's not something that you can take and run with. And I think that another recent an example of that is I was walking country with two separate clients, and I was sharing just knowledge. I just seem to talk underwater. So if something kind of pops up along my way, I would, yes, Kylie. I will just kind of just openly share what I need to, or I think is important at that time in that space. But unfortunately, I had one of the clients behind me recording everything I was saying. And then 2 weeks later, he developed a design brief, presented me the design brief and said, this is exactly what you said. And went, but took the whole story and the whole knowledge out of context and only put half that story into the description of the brief, which then destroyed it and completely disregarded the story and the knowledge and the sacredness that it held. And not once was I asked. So I think being able to understand that we still hold that knowledge, we still hold that language and those stories, and that when we may share with you, but we'll be sharing with you at that time. It's not a sharing that we can then say that's fine to be sharing in a public realm, and especially when it's taken out of context. And when it's taken out of the context, or a story is then painted or misinterpreted, that's where cultural appropriation comes into play as well. And cultural appropriation is a huge issue. There is a lot of lateral violence, racism inside a minority group. And unfortunately, cultural appropriation does happen with our own people. So when we're talking about people telling stories or artwork or knowledge, that knowledge comes from their country, not from our country. And when you try to interpret somehow somebody else's cultural knowledge or their landscape, that's when issues can become, they get blown up. So being able to understand that you may have engaged with one group of people, but if you're going out to kind of to develop on that or to expand on that or to put it into a new framework, you can't just go to another person and expect that person to be able to culturally and respectfully interpret that knowledge and story appropriately. But when we're talking about language is a huge thing, and I know I'm running out of time, but quickly, language is a huge thing. For our people, especially Dori people, we're in a reclamation, revitalisation and a renewal stage for our language. So we have community language, we have family language, but we also have a historical language. And unfortunately, because of taboos and because of history, some of our language was never passed down. And so we're relearning that. But for us and for our country needs to hear language to be able to be reawakened, to be able to heal herself, to heal our people. And without language, we don't get our stories. Okay, our country gives us our language and our language gives us our stories. So it's an ever-flowing connection. But our language cannot be looked up. So always check, don't go and say, oh, I just want to say good morning, but I'm going to go look it up in a dictionary. Always check your language with somebody of that speaking. Audio is wonderful. Written, if we can't get audio, is great. But being able, and I'm really big on place naming and dual naming, being able to put traditional names back onto country is really, really important. It's about recreating our history into the forefront, and it's about recognising the significance and the history and the connection that our people have to that landscape. So when we're talking about how to then put cultural values into interpreting any sort of interpretation and about truth telling, don't be scared, because our history is a very dark history. It's a very sad and very traumatic history, but unfortunately our truth telling hasn't been told properly. And a lot of the time people are too scared to tell the truth the way it is because they don't want to offend somebody. But when you're thinking about it, don't worry about offending somebody, because you've offended us for 200 years. You've kept us quiet. You've taken away our connection. You've taken away our land. You've taken our stories and our language and our people. So don't offend somebody else. Like, step up for our people. But interpretation and truth telling can be taught through different ways. We can do it through art. And art doesn't have to be in your face. We can do it through signage, and we can do it through, a lot of the time we're starting to do preset motifs in the concretes. So that they're very subtle, but my feeling is if you ignite curiosity, you go through to education. So we want to ignite that curiosity. We don't want to give everybody all the information. We want them to kind of get a taste for it and want to go and find more. And that's probably the best way that we can ask that truth telling and interpretation can be done. Let us tell the true story. Like I was saying before, we have a dark story, but it's a story that needs to be told. And don't be shy. A lot of people want that truth telling, and really well, it's coming into the forefront now. They want to tell the truth. And Kylie helped us do that about 12 months ago. So thank you, Kylie. There was a lot of interps done in one of our spaces in the Hawkesbury, and Kylie pulled that together, and it's amazing. So unfortunately, a lot of the time our people, a lot of the settlers are given this, put on this pedestal as this great person, and the stories being told are just so heroic. But that's covering the truth. The truth is that these people, yes, we're great people in the eyes of the white people, but that same person that you're idolising is the one that was putting martial law and killing our people at the same time. He was the one lynching us from trees. So find that balance in between the truth telling and the interpretation and the story that is getting told. But when we're putting it straight back into the built environment, look at it as a culturally responsive interpretation. So looking at the materials that we're using, don't take materials off country and bring new materials in, put them aside and reuse them, because our earth, our grounds, everything holds DNA. And if you're removing somebody's DNA or our earth's DNA, you're disrupting our songs, you're disrupting our cultural value and landscape. When you're designing, use the shapes and the patterns that you see in country. Use the colours of the earth, of the trees, of the waterways. Use the textures. Bring in all types of sensory kind of elements. Use art, and again, art doesn't have to be a painting. Art can be the way things are shaped. And really look at the landscape. When you're looking at the landscape, bring that into play and use it when you're actually doing landscaping in garden beds. So, I mean, these are different ways that our interprets have been done really well. So in the top picture is Gosford Leagues Park. And what they've done is a story, it's a tidal park. So what you can see the children running over the top is actually coming in, and is the ebb and flow of the tides. But inside that flooring has been etched out little fish. And so when the tide comes in, it looks like these fish are shimmering and swimming through the water. And that's kind of being able to retell and to keep the story alive on that space. we've used audio books where it's about somebody, again, using that digital element and downloading an audio story for a walk along a riverline. And we've got 11 stories around our riverlines at the moment. So there's no need for signage. And you can do it in your own space, in your own time. And it's about using every element that you can. And again, the bottom one is about using the shapes and the textures and the reflections and the shading from our natural environment to recreate. So what that was is a big place for the honey, our native bees. And our native bees is a massive songline for our marriages across the country. So recreating that space, using honeycomb shaping in our shelters that reflect the light through shading is really wonderful. But digital is like the best way we can get stuff done. So whether it's geotagging, whether it's through websites, whether it's through QR codes, whether it's through audio walks, whether it's through school programs. And I think the best thing with it being digital is that as we learn more, our stories, our knowledge can be added to. When you have a written or a printed or a physical element, the cost for that is so high. And when you're using a digital element, being able to refurbish and to update and to add new data into that space is an amazing thing. So that we're not always looking back at history and rewriting it, we're actually updating it as we go. And I think that is all I have to say. I've gone over time, so I'm sorry.
No, you're quite okay. No problem whatsoever, Erin. It's always a pleasure to listen to you speak. Our next speaker for today is Alice. So I will just go back to sharing this screen, Alice. And yes, quite rightly, lots of claps. Where is it? Let's see. Let's hope I got it the right one. Yep, good. Okay, all yours.
Okay, off we go. So I'm coming at this from another point of view, my years as an architect. So we can never be someone else, although we can exhibit empathy and understanding of their lived experience and their interface with the world around them. The assistance and direction from others to accurately translate and communicate that lived experience is vital. Some psychologists express that in consultation, success is not necessarily the intention to understand or empathize, but it's the recipient's experience of receiving that understanding, of their hope of being understood, is where the success lies. In some way, this mirroring is all that we need to get started, but does that give us enough information to interpret accurately in design? An appreciation of this concept in design began in the 1960s with the process of cooperative design or participatory design, where user groups in factories were brought together to discuss ways to improve processes and tools in their workplaces to improve productivity. This process was also applied to software design. Some processes were experience and action-based, such as roles, actions, and reactions were played out to test efficacy of design innovation. Fundamental to this was the designer's acknowledgement that they cannot hold all the answers to the multitude of questions posed in a design. In a similar period, there was a growing understanding in the social sciences of cross-cultural research methodologies and how our own biases and knowledge can influence the outcome of research involving other cultural groups. Architects have been attempting to specifically design for Australian First Nations people since the 1950s. Government-run social housing is possibly the earliest documented movement and was implemented as a nationally funded program to move city, suburban, and fringe dwellers from around regional country towns from their humpies and campsites into ordered housing. Essentially, this housing was not much different than what was supplied in any other social housing, although there were particular conveniences such as built-in beds and tables. And whilst this housing had the benefit of providing secure accommodation, it also had a price tag and obligations of house maintenance and behaviour. It also did not provide for community living, and of course, the Aboriginal people were blamed. The 1960s and 70s saw many more models trialled in remote and urban situations, all with a range of successes and failures. My personal favourite, and I have not been able to find a photograph of this, was a spiral-shaped concrete structure which was constructed in a remote desert location. I heard a story that the centre of the spiral got so hot in summer that the community used it to dry meat. There was no potential for cross-ventilation, and I presume that the architect was inspired by a circular pattern on an artwork. Anyway, there's also been numerous buildings shaped like animals that could only be understood from flying above, which is something that, I don't do every day. And there was little to address the functionality and the needs of the users. It was on the foundation of all of that I entered architectural studies in the late 1980s. I had recently moved from Tasmania, in the small island state in the southeast corner of Australia, and I moved to Western Australia to a place of endless horizons and vast countryside. This is the western half of the continent. Its capital, Perth, was a boom and bust mining town, growing up in the wake of an America's Cup Challenge and a new mining boom. It had a visible Aboriginal community, which was not present in Tasmania at the time, and it had a very visible gap in the economic, physical and mental well-being and empowerment of that community. Such began my journey and my education to understand Australia's other history. Next slide. So early in my architectural study, I was introduced to Christopher Alexander's pattern language, the architect's pictorial guide to solving common design problems, and it provided numerous solutions based on objective evidence-based theory rather than a theoretical approach to design. Alexander demystified complex socio-spatial considerations through a simple building block format, which made his content very accessible. It is still one of the most widely read publications ever published. There are, however, substantial flaws in the application of these patterns, and even Alexander recognised it. He actually encouraged people to develop their own patterns based on their own particular experience. The theory behind Alexander's work was that traditional buildings were intrinsically more beautiful than those built by contemporary architects. And I think we're losing light. We've got mood lighting on. And I suppose I can't argue with that, being a heritage architect, but he believed that traditional buildings are a product of a communally shared value system, and they demonstrate piecemeal adaptation to changing circumstances, which brings all the forces impacting a design into a harmonious balance. In contrast, contemporary architecture results from an imposition of formal rules and abstract concepts upon a single design episode, creating an outcome where forces are unbalanced. His further collaborative studies and experiments resulted in an ongoing architectural discourse, with later works by Lynch and Jacobs and others, which focused on the importance of cognitive cohesion, vitality, and piecemeal growth as part of a vibrant built environment. In third year, we commenced studies in post-occupancy evaluation. This examines the functioning of buildings by both observation and interview. And the reason is to discover how well buildings suit their occupants. This process is seen as vital to enable architects to learn from their successes and mistakes in design, but it's something that rarely occurs. It involves dedication by the occupants to openly participate in the process, and it involves the skill and training on behalf of the architect to ask the right questions. Now, I wasn't a patient student, so I also had other interests and picked up some units in Aboriginal studies at another university. I studied Aboriginal politics and did the course in cross-cultural research, which highlighted some of Alexander's challenges in defining a pattern language, because it is from our lived experience that we design. So how do you start designing for another culture? So back in fourth year, we studied participatory design. And this was the process in particular that I thought would help cross that cultural divide in design. At the end of the year, I was very lucky to get a placement with the health department, and that resulted in my introduction to the Perth Aboriginal Medical Service, where I was tasked with finding out what they needed in their new building. From a holiday placement to a thesis and eventually a building, I practiced my skills in developing a brief and a pattern or design language for more experienced architects to design a building that would fulfill the need of its users and the needs of the community. I stayed alongside my client for 5 years, from briefing, study, volunteering, lobbying for land and capital investment, the appointment of architects and builders, and working with Aboriginal artists to embed design into resilient floor covering, as can be seen in this photo, and to adorn the walls with the artwork of the local community. The degree of trust that is critical in working with Aboriginal people was demonstrated by the involvement with further projects with both the medical service and with other Aboriginal organisations. Now, I'm not saying I got it right, and there was sort of things on both sides that, you know, we got to the finished building and we go, oh yeah, so that's what you meant. Oh yeah, didn't I say that? But this is part of what design means, and that review of design is really important. So the Aboriginal author Bill Nagy said, "No good, I explain. If man or woman, you don't worry about this story. Just leave him. Let him go." So he was from Northern Australia, and he understood that you can tell your story all you want, but people won't necessarily listen or necessarily understand. And especially if the story is confronting, it's a natural thing for humans to withdraw physically and emotionally from things in the external environment that frighten and overwhelm us. So our hard history is something that we do have to tell. And I think that getting this voice to Parliament is going to be one of those difficult hurdles for those who still are frightened to go forward. The recognition of connecting with country by the government architect in New South Wales is a very positive step, but it's still a very complex and misunderstood document and process. Connecting with country training is now mandated in the architect's annual continuing professional development. Not sure how that's going to go, but we'll see. Hopefully we can get some people to sit down and listen and understand. The notion of the connecting with country document is much wider than a simple product of architecture. It extends the understanding to caring for country, the recognition of strong cultural connections to land, water, stars and sky. And that's sometimes a difficult thing to apply in a highly modified city environment. So despite having a very complex document by the government architect, we don't necessarily have clear processes of how we should integrate our shared knowledge of the cultural practice into design without the tokenism of a crocodile-shaped building or the hero art piece in the foyer. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing for the Aboriginal community or for our community generally, but I'm not sure how much it goes to enhancing the interpretation of the significance of country and how much it benefits the design outcome. The main benefit is the education, and that will enhance Australians' understanding of our history and improve our collective cultural approach to design and planning for others. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, there you have it. That's us done in terms of giving you a point of view, or 3 points of view, really, from an Australian perspective on the things that are happening here that are hopefully excelling us into being positive in interpretation and in art, design, culture, knowledge, education, and hopefully the journey forward will be one paved with a lot more wins, and we can deal with a lot of our dark past and set the years to come in a much better light in the world stage, and we can start to show, you know, our resilience in coming up with good practices. So thank you, ladies, and for your time, and we're happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Let me just stop sharing this. Yeah, I can bring people back.
I didn't find questions in the chat or in Q&A, but I have a question.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, there's people listening from all over the world, either now live or in the future, a tape version of this. And many of us may live in a place where we know there's untold stories from a variety of people, especially Native peoples and the like. If I was that individual, how would I get started? Any advice that you could give us? I'm just fascinated with the process that Australia has now and the aspect of the challengings behind this. But if I was an individual and I didn't really have connections or didn't know what to do or how to get started, what advice would any of the three of you might give us?
Well, I'll start, and I know Erin will have a perspective on this as well. But what I've found, and something that I've learned over the days, is to just go out and ask. I mean, I just put myself out there all the time into community. So in Australia, we have local Aboriginal land councils, which provide, you know, a structured way of you know, sort of connecting with people. But I have found that whilst they're fantastic in a lot of cases, they're also a little bit hit and miss with who they represent in terms of community, or which community members are part of that organisation. So I have found to literally go and try and find locals in any area that I'm working with. And I am very happy to say that what I have discovered about the Aboriginal culture, which may be similar to other cultures, is that once I connected with a group and was accepted as part of, you know, that by that group into being somebody who was worthy to speak to, which is very part of that trust building exercise. I received then introductions into other people and other groups and other places, and it's been highly beneficial and very much part of that relationship building. So yeah, from my point of view, it's just putting yourself out there and saying, hey, I need help and I would like to find the right person to speak to. Erin, I'm sure you have a different take on that as well.
Yeah, good and bad. So I have a lot of people that reach out, and unfortunately they will send you an email and say, have you got half an hour to talk to me so I can learn about Aboriginal culture? And it's like, I'm not going to teach you 60,000 years worth of our knowledge and our culture over a phone in half an hour. So I think the best thing that people can do is reach out and find events that are happening. We have lots of events that go on. It's not just the iconic NAIDOC. Aboriginal culture is celebrated every single day. And there are events all the way across the country. In our cultural calendar, there are 2 out of 12 months that don't have an Aboriginal event. So there are plenty of events that go on. Go to those events, reach out and make those connections. And depending on how long or what your relationship is how much they're going to share with you. But remembering that I talk a lot, as you may have already seen, but I'm quite open to share the knowledge that I think is relevant for you at your place in your journey. There's times where people are going to come and ask the question, because there's no silly question. The last thing that we can, the only worst thing that we can do is either ignore you, hit you with silence, or say, come back later. So you're going to get an answer, whether it's immediate or whether it's in 3 months' time. But it's about understanding, and there's so much tokenism about why you want to know, and so much exploitation with that. And so we need to understand what you're going to do with that knowledge as well. So, and people have got to understand that there is knowledge, and sometimes there is knowledge that you want that is sacred that we can't disclose. Or sometimes it's gender knowledge, so I can't talk on behalf of men. So, and things like that. So it's about understanding and appreciating our culture. Ask the questions, but don't ever get offended if we're going to sit in silence or we're going to ask you to come back and ask it later. But take that journey, walk with us on our country, learn our stories for what you can at the time, and build that relationship. That in that relationship building, you'll get to know your language, you'll get to know your knowledge and your stories of country that you live and work on.
Thank you. Alice, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, certainly my experience is really the importance of building trust, to know that you actually, that there is genuine intention is very important. To understand that not everyone is going to drop their hat and turn around and go, oh yes, so I'm sure we've got time to talk to you about something. You are just another person. It is not the main business of Aboriginal people to go around and tell you things if they don't want to tell you things. The projects that I've been involved in have been particularly Aboriginal community projects. So they're driven by the community. And I think that's quite a different experience to when you've got, say, a public space or a public building project where Aboriginal people are brought into that project to say, oh no, tell us about your country now after 200 years of, destroying your culture. And yeah, we might put like a painting on the wall, which would be really good. But it's still, there is still a positive out of that. There is a recognition, that recognition is growing. So, yeah.
Beck asks the question of how do you approach truth telling through design?
That there is a loaded question.
I was
think.
just going to say that. And how much time do we all have?
Yes, exactly. I think the short answer is you need to get the right people in the room to find out what the truth telling is that they want told. I think that's fundamentally the question that needs to be asked at the first stage, is because, you know, something, again, the Western idea of going in and going, we must tell the truth, and coming up with what their truth is completely different to actually going to the people of that location, those lands, and asking the custodians, what is it that you want told here? And, you know, you might find out that the truth telling is that they want the area to be told and known for the wonderful nature reserves that have, you know, fed their people for years. It might not be something that you think you need to shove down everybody's throat. So yeah, I think that fundamentally it is to ask the question and listen, and don't impose your own thoughts on it to start with.
Great advice. Bray asked a question. I worry that we talk about Aboriginal culture as if all Aboriginal people have the same culture. Is this the case, or is there a better language we can use?
I'm going to quickly jump on that. Okay, so in the world, we have 3,800 cultures, and Aboriginal culture is considered one of that 3,800. Inside our Aboriginal culture, we have 300 to 500 separate cultures. So, and it's funny when people come up and they go, oh, do you speak Aboriginal language? And it's like, I speak Darrell. And they're like, oh, is that Aboriginal language? It's like, no, I speak Darrell. So you got to learn about the place that you want to find out, and learn the language of the people, so that we're not going up and saying, oh, I want to talk about Aboriginal culture. Well, we can talk generically, but what I can tell you is I can tell you about Barry culture. So we are all very different. We all have our different languages, our belief systems, our food sources, our resources. So it's finding out and honing into the where you live, and using the lingo. Use the words of talk about your mob. Tell us about your mob. Tell us about your country, and specific. So, like in the chat, I loved seeing that Newcastle and the Brisbane traditional names were put in. So you know those names. Go in and ask those people, well, how about you tell us about this country or this place or whatever. If you want to know about a different country, travel to that area and ask them, because we're all different, and it's about honing in onto the locational culture of that landscape, not somebody else's in a generic view, because we're so different.
Well, thank you all. We've gone over, which is fine. This has been a very, very fascinating discussion and so relevant to so many parts of the world. And it's really wonderful to learn more now of what's happening in Australia. For those of you who are interested in the rest of ours, we have one more group to go. Interpretive Network of New Zealand will be presenting on November 10th. So we'd encourage you to pay attention to your association's website and or emails you may get. And this will also be being recorded and will also be posted on the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation website. So thank you everyone for participating today, especially our panelists, and for Kylie for organizing this. And in closing, I just want to remind you all that interpretation is a seed, not a tree. So let's go forth and plant those seeds. Thank you.
Thank you.